Welcome to Let's Talk About Mental Health. I'm Nels Kloster. I'm an addiction psychiatrist.
And I'm Robert Stack. I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, licensed mental health counselor.
Okay.
Good evening.
And as always, I want to remind people that we enjoy your questions. You can contact us through our Facebook site at www.facebook.com/letstalkvt or emails at questions@letstalkvt.com.
And last week, I remember we were finishing it up, and someone asked, "How long can my family be angry at me?" And
right,
we sort of said,
5 years, 30 years.
And we're sort of talking about it. But and someone mentioned to me since then, they enjoyed the show and said they liked it. But one person, a friend of mine, sort of implied that he says, "I thought I'd let the addict get off easy." I forget how he said it. In other words, I wrote it down and it said, "You seem to make light of the effect on the family," and that was not my intention. If you don't mind, I'll take a few minutes to talk about this. I mean, obviously, alcoholism and drug addiction affects the family, and I mean, it affects everybody in the family. My friend John Moran, he used to say, it's almost as if the family's in a family car and they have an accident, and everybody in the car is affected by the accident, some more so than others, and there's lots of different people involved. And so, one of the things that I should mention is that, in the beginning sometimes when it's brand new to the folks, what they try and do is they try and figure out how to live with it, how to manage it. And because of the nature of addiction and alcoholism, especially if it's with children, and also with parents, with the husband or wife, sometimes more so with the wife, there's a little mixture of shame. And so in that shame is people don't talk much about it, they don't get help, and it becomes like something that's held within the family. And often in the beginning, and I used to talk about this on Family Day, you'll see families sometimes start off as rescuers, trying to take care of a loved one, trying to do the right thing and get involved. And that works for a while, but they get very frustrated because, like I said last week, they're trying to get the person better, and sometimes the person is not ready to get better. And then they'll get into a mode where they start to sort of be, I don't know, the word they use in the field is prosecutor. They begin to sort of go after them and, you're doing this, you're doing that, and they try coercion and punishment and things like that.
Dictating, things are very authoritarian.
Yeah, trying to make it work, like you did this and this is going to happen, and there's a lot of screaming and yelling, and sometimes there's, bad feelings all around. And ultimately, sometimes at the end, and this I think is one of the saddest parts, family members will begin to feel victimized. And they begin to feel like, this disease, this alcoholism and drug addiction, this is hurting everybody. And it's not something I've done. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm not doing it, and yet it's really changed our lives, changed the way I feel about myself. And you'll sometimes see that. And family members will often, well, you have to be careful because sometimes they, they, like I mentioned, shame. Sometimes they blame each other. You'll see parents blame each other, or they'll get into this idea that it reflects on them and it hurts their self-esteem, and they begin to have a lower sense of who they are and what they are.
I mean, how many times, as parents, right, feeling that you have a responsibility for your child's actions and how they go, and oftentimes we've seen with a crisis with individual development or along the lines of the family, nobody expects this to happen. This isn't what anybody planned for. Right. And then you find yourself there sort of helpless and blaming yourself and blaming anybody rather than sort of realizing this is just the kind of thing that happens and learning how to move on from that. So going through a lot of stages, it sounds like.
That's right. And you'll see it, every family is unique, right? I mean, in tragedy, and every family reacts differently, but you'll sometimes see it. And I also want to mention that occasionally what you'll see with some families, people who are involved with addicts and alcoholics, is they'll try and get to a point where they're numb. And they'll literally say things like, "Oh, I don't care, do whatever you want to do. I'm sick of worrying about it. I can't do this anymore." Right. And it's a form of protection, if you will. It's a form of sort of sealing off and saying, I can't allow your behavior to hurt me this much. And they try and get numb. And as I used to share, one of my concerns with that is that it's probably a good defense mechanism on some level. That might be the wrong phrase to use.
Well, like we talked about last week, that would seeming not to believe that the person with a substance problem was getting better, it was genuine, that this was a way of sort of protecting themselves from pain by waiting to actually see the results, as opposed to, once again, believing and being afraid that that's a false hope and being sort of set up for being hurt.
And the other thing that happens is sometimes they're so busy not feeling the pain, they don't feel anything. And this is when you'll sometimes run into family members who are sort of, you know, they're not happy, they're not sad, they're not angry, they're not, you know, they're just trying to get through the day in a very sort of matter-of-fact way, you know, and you know, it takes a lot of joy out of a family. And I guess the last thing I would sort of say is that occasionally you'll see them get to a point where they're struggling with grief. And in that grief is the anger and depression. And so family members, you know, if I should just mention this because of the question last week, and you know, they're still angry, and they may still be working through it. They may still, I mean, it's part of grieving sometimes. It's part of expressing your feelings and emotions. So I didn't mean to make light of it last week, you know, about like 5 years, how long they're going to bring it up. But I don't think the alcoholic and the addict has a sense of what everybody else is experiencing. I mean, they sort of know that they're upset and they sort of know that they're bothered by it, but to how much, I'm not really clear. So I wanted to say that, you know, that anger that that family has, they probably earned it.
Right.
They probably, I mean, the addict probably, the alcoholic probably earned the anger that's coming toward them.
Right.
And the family member who's angry is probably dealing with a lot of issues.
Yeah. And then we've heard about, too, I mean, stages of say, the stages of death, I believe, was with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross.
Right.
And it sounds like from what you're saying, this probably applies to the family in this situation as well, right? There's this, first of all, this sort of, you know, denial that this thing is happening.
Yeah.
Then there's a sense of, you know, bargaining. No, not me. It can't be. And then the anger piece, right? How could this happen to me? And then the depression, this sort of, you know, I can't believe it. I'm so sad. I'm just, the fight is out of me. And then finally, even the point of sort of accepting it. And then in that case, you know, sort of a good death, as they call it, for coming to terms with that and making your, you know, making your amends and cementing your relationships. And this is just striking me as very similar to that as you're talking about these stages.
I used to use Kubler-Ross when I used to do Family Day to sort of introduce those ideas, but I've sort of stopped pinpointing that because I've read more and more of what she had in mind and the way she was thinking about it. Some original research was on a cancer unit. The time span was much smaller. And anyway, but you're right. It does look like there's that stage that people go through, and some people get sort of stuck in the anger. But so I just wanted to follow up on that question, and I appreciate my friend's comment.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't mean to make light of it. I mean, obviously, it's a serious issue, and like I said last week, a lot of alcoholics and addicts, when they first get better, wish everybody had a little bit of amnesia. You know, like you don't need to bring that up, and you don't need to talk about it. But sometimes the families are still working through it. They're still dealing with it. And
maybe a plug for Al-Anon as well, to help families to learn how to navigate the illness, the disruption in their family. And there's some other groups around too that have sort of the same purpose. If you look for, you know, families struggling with addiction of their children, for example, there's a group I know in Western Massachusetts focusing specifically on this. I mean, Al-Anon is, you know,
Narcanon is a family for narcotics. But the thing that's weird is that because of the shame, like if they, you know, I remember working in the hospital and people would come up to the hospital and the family would actually lie about where they were. I mean, because they didn't want everybody gossiping and talking about it. So the normal kind of support that you would get from friends, neighbors, church, fellow employees, maybe even other relatives, you know, if Joe's in the hospital with cancer, I mean, you know, you get cards from the third grade.
People make dinner for your family.
Yeah,
right,
you know, all that.
Sort of situation.
So you don't get that normal support. And that's one of the reasons why you sometimes have to reach out and get help from other, you know, support groups, because you're really not using those normal supports that you would use in a moment of family crisis or because of the shame and the guilt that you'll sometimes run into. A lot of people feel like alcoholism and drug addiction is a reflection upon the family and the quality of the family, and so there's a tendency not to share, and they don't want people to think ill of the family member, and so they'll not get that normal support one would get.
It's a shame when you consider how widespread these problems are.
Oh yeah.
Right. It happens to it happens to good families.
That's right. It happens to everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that was the nice thing about Betty Ford when she came out. You know, the president's
Right. How much better a family could you have?
The
right?
first lady, coming out saying, I have this problem with alcohol and getting treatment in the Betty Ford Center, of course, all that. But at the moment when she did it, that was incredible. I mean, it was like just stepping out, and I think made a huge difference, huge impact.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. Thank you.
Yeah, good. And this is the second question. Depression runs in my family. Is there anything I can do? Good. Yeah, no, that's a perfect question, because I think when we look at any sort of issues, whether it's with addiction or depression, I think most illnesses, even much less not even just mental illnesses, we always talk about genetic and environmental components to it, right? How much of this is inherited, the nature piece, I was born this way, versus how much of this is part of the environment, or what you would consider the nurture piece of it. And there was a very, I say, elegant, I guess is the right term, study in a famous science journal called Nature magazine, maybe about, it might be 10 years ago by now, where they were looking at, there's a certain gene they looked at around serotonin, which we think is an important chemical with depression. And they found that there were sort of just 3 different genetic sort of, combinations of this one gene. A long and a long form, a long and a short, and 2 short forms. And they looked at they grouped people according to which one of these sort of genetic sets that they had. And then they looked at how many sort of significant events that happened, such as a divorce or a death, or I think maybe a natural disaster too. And what they found out was that the more events, the more severe events that had happened to people, right, the more likely they were to become depressed. But they also noticed that the different gene makeups made you either more vulnerable or more resistant to actually being depressed, which is sort of a nice way of saying, yes, it is. Is it nature, is it nurture? And the answer is yes, it's both.
It's both.
Yeah.
So one of the things when I heard this, and most of my work has been in addiction, and I used to tell people, like, they said, well, what about my kids? What should I say to them about it? And one of the things I think works, I used to recommend that they normalize it, that they, if they see something on TV that talked about substance abuse or alcoholism, and you have your young children or your children there, just say, well, that runs in our family, or that's something to be concerned about, and that's something that, that has happened to Uncle so-and-so, your grandfather. And you're not like giving them permission, saying, okay, you can grow up to be an alcoholic. What you're saying is that, we have that genetic risk. You need to be really careful about it, and because just like it runs in our family, but you don't do it all in one night, and you don't do it in one lecture.
Absolutely.
You do it over a period of time. You introduce the idea, and and feel free to talk about it and tell them that this is a risk, that you're a little bit different than your friends.
Right.
You're a little bit different. So when you go out and experiment, you're at higher risk than somebody else.
Right.
And so I think that's one of the things you can do with depression too.
Right, because if somebody in your family had developed lung cancer young, like in their 40s or 50s, then that would sort of be a signal, whoa, maybe I shouldn't smoke. Same thing with alcohol. Maybe I shouldn't drink because there's alcoholism in my family. And same thing with depression. So how do you then develop resiliency, especially with children?
Right.
And I mean, part of that is having sort of good social skills. Right, being able to sort of get your needs met, being able to stand up for yourself, to sort of awareness of your emotions and awareness of your feelings, sort of develop a rhythm with your interactions, how to sort of taking time away. So many times, say with introversion and extroversion, people introverted need to have time alone to recharge their batteries. I think all of us, to be well, need to have social connection. I can't say enough about exercise being a good way to sort of improve a mood as well. And that there are these things you do, sort of anything that improves the quality of your life, I would say, is really going to be helpful for battling depression. For kids in schools, having relationships with adults outside of the family, positive role models are a very important piece of this as well.
No, and the only thing I would sort of worry about sometimes is that you have to give your family members space, and there's recently a book published that talked about the value of being an introvert. I mean, we all acknowledge, the extrovert, but the introvert has its role also, or her role in life and in families. But I think it's a fine line sometimes when someone if you're worried about a child who won't come out of his room, or, doesn't engage in activities and seems to begin to is that just growing up? Is that just introversion? Is that, normal? And I think that, you need to talk about it. And I know I'm a big fan of talk therapy, but I think that's probably the most important thing. I don't know most important, but it's probably high on the list, is that people have permission to talk about their feelings.
Right. And to feel those feelings too.
Right, and express them in some way without recrimination or lecture or anything else. And that's not always easily done for some folks.
Yeah, and we used to think that children couldn't possibly be depressed. And I think we realize now that that's false, that children really can be depressed. So, and then that, when do you move in, when do you move out, what's the right amount of sort of attention and inattention, and sort of the hovering. So when is it sort of a normal sort of childlike response, or teenage angst, or whatever it might be. But I think always being engaged, raising the possibilities, being there, inquiring maybe gently, and keeping in touch with the kids and keeping conversation open. I think that's really, really essential.
I remember just feeling terrible when at one point a therapist that was working wanted to asked me about a family member and whether or not they're going to put them on medicine or not, and it was sort of like, part of me was like, no, I don't, but the other part is, you have to listen to professionals. I mean, if they think it might be appropriate, it might be helpful. I mean, it's so difficult. It's so hard to know. I mean,
but counseling, right? Getting professionals. You don't have to be in counseling forever. One thing too is nobody likes feeling depressed. There's really sort of issues around self-esteem for a child who finds himself withdrawn and depressed. Maybe you get picked on even. And I think, like we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, and you'd mentioned normalizing, there's a way to sort of, realize that this does happen to a lot of people, and unfortunately it's happening to me, to us, whoever that might be, and learning ways of thinking around that, sort of not letting yourself get dragged down by those dark thoughts, but recognizing that maybe the way you look at things has an impact, and that if you change the way you look at things, you might be able to feel better.
And understand that your children are studying you all the time. I mean, so it's important if you want to model good behavior. You want to model healthy behavior.
Right.
I mean, it's because if you're not, they'll understand that there's a difference between what you say and what you do, right. And children just. I mean, even when they get teenagers and they don't want to be you, they still have your values. They've still been watching you. They still have that idea about it. So I think good modeling of good mental health is important also.
Yeah, and I think when we had Mary Ellen Copeland on the show, and with the RAC program, Wellness, Recovery, and Action program, part of what is, one, of course, having hope that you will get better and you can be well, having a responsibility. Also, educating yourself, learning about this whole thing called depression, so that you're more aware of sort of the pattern of it and the flow of it, and then developing. Again, we often don't have an active plan. So thinking about things that help you to be well, music, reading, dancing, being out in nature, incorporating these things in your daily life and realizing they have to be part of your daily life. It's not something like stress management also is like this. You can't put it off for like the weekend. It has to be sort of part of every day, and you start to recognize signs when you're sort of stressed and what sort of triggers are out there for you, and develop a proactive plan around that. Taking responsibility.
I'm always worried that when we talk like this, it sounds like I was like a real good parent or something, you know what I mean? I really, and I don't mean to sound, no, because it's true. I mean, parenting was like the roughest job, and being a step-parent is really hard, and, trying to figure out how to do these things. I mean, I heard somebody say, the day they explained everything, I must have missed school that day or something. You know what I mean? I didn't get that book or something.
I mean, how many times have we had to apologize to our kids for being flawed in the ways that we are?
I used to tell my daughter that she was better at being their daughter than I was at being her parent. I mean, really, I know, because I could hear myself talking like, oh yeah, sounds like you know what you're talking about, Robert. And it's like, you do, but it's tough being a parent, and boy, it's really scary if you you worry about them, and you worry like, oh, what is this about? What's going on? So I wonder if that's where that question is coming from.
I hope we did okay with it.
Yeah, we don't have any one answer for it,
Right. No. Again, I mean, professional help, having a well family, having well routines are very important.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So then another question. This one looks to be about medication. My son is getting the Vivitrol injection. Is that dangerous? How long does it last? Okay. So this is interesting. So Vivitrol is a form of naltrexone. It's it's not unusual. There are a number of medications where you can take them in a pill form, and then they also develop a form that you can put into an injection that can then be say deposited in the muscles, and then it slowly disperses or leaks out, whatever term you want to use.
Well, you want to say naltrexone is an opiate blocker.
Right, it's an opiate
blocker. This is for the treatment of opiate addiction. Okay.
Exactly, or even for alcohol.
Or alcohol, okay.
The idea, so, we've talked about Suboxone and methadone.
Right.
That those are actually opioid medications that are long-lasting, that we can sort of control the dose, and therefore take away withdrawal and cravings from people using opioids. Naltrexone is what's called an antagonist, or strictly as a blocker. So it fits into the opioid receptors, but it absolutely does not let anything else get in there, and it does not sort of turn them on. So while you think about, morphine, methadone, Suboxone, they could relieve pain, for example, and also in high doses, people talk about having euphoria. The naltrexone does none of that. So in theory, what it does is it stops any other opioids from getting into your receptor. So if you have the naltrexone on board, then what happens is let's say you're in a recovery program you don't want to use, but you have a lapse. Like we talked about, you're the wrong people, places, something comes up, and you decide to use that heroin, for example, cannot get into the receptor. So it cannot then, say, turn you on and give you that euphoric or that warm fuzzy or the nodding out, fading away sort of feeling. And the idea is that then takes away, say, the positive reinforcement, the thing that attracts you to the heroin.
And this is the drug that they've been talking about giving people permission to inject when someone OD'd.
Exactly,
EMTs and stuff.
So naltrexone, Narcan, they do the same thing, they sound the same. As the idea there is that, again, it sort of wins a competition to sit in the receptor. So if somebody, for example, is overdosed on heroin, that's dangerous because it stops the brainstem signals and the breathing, and so people stop breathing, and that's how they die. Then what you can do is you would take Narcan either through the nasal route or an injection, or if you were in the emergency department, through an intravenous line, and it would then knock the heroin out of the receptor and occupy the receptor, so you no longer have the heroin sort of turning down the breathing signals, and it sits in there then so that you're saved.
Right.
So the idea here is that you take this pill, and one of the things that happens is with taking the naltrexone pill, it's good for a day. Take it once every day, and then people will often decide to stop taking it. So say on an impulse, today I wake up, I'm mad, today's a terrible day, I really want to have a drink, or I'm just tired of thinking and feeling this stuff, or you've been around the encouragements to return to using again, then you stop taking the medication.
Right.
And then it's much easier then to sort of get off your recovery path. So the idea with the Vivitrol, then the injection, is that now you can put this into the muscles, and you will have a supply of naltrexone in your bloodstream for a full month. So if I decide after a week out of the hospital, I have the Vivitrol, and I say, you know what, I'm going to drink, or I want to sort of snort or shoot up some heroin, and you do that, the receptor's occupied by the naltrexone, which sort of holds the receptor so nothing else can get in, and so you've, in essence, you wasted your money because you didn't get the effect that you wanted with heroin, and with what you hear from alcohol is you don't get the same sort of pleasure from the alcohol, and so you lose that reinforcement that this is supposed to feel good, the heroin feels good, the alcohol feels good, you don't feel anything.
So you feel anything.
So you're like, that was a waste. And maybe it gets you over a hurdle then that allows you to keep on building your skills towards a solid recovery.
Now I remember hearing about this when they had these rapid detoxes that were done down in New York and New Jersey, where someone would go in for 72 hours and they would come out with that. But they had some adverse effects. Were there any adverse effects from that, or why was the bad reputation about that?
If you take this too soon, you would be put into withdrawal.
Okay.
We call it precipitated withdrawal.
Right.
So, and then too, maybe some people don't react to any medication very well. So you always want to make sure that, I mean, anything that's too short is going to be sort of taxing and ineffective. But you want to make sure people tolerate the medication. So you would not go straight to an injection, because if you had a reaction, the terrible thing that would be for medication is hanging around your system for a full month. So people would have to have sort of like a washout period, no opiates for about 7 days to be safe, and then take the naltrexone pill, so you'd make sure you weren't having an adverse reaction to the medication. And then say, okay, now we're safe. We haven't had any adverse reactions. We haven't had any we haven't forced any withdrawal by knocking opiates out of the receptors. So now it's safe to go with this injection.
Okay, and that injection, it lasts for 30 days.
Right.
But on the 31st day, or 32nd or 30, whatever it might be, people go back to using. And can they can use other drugs while they're on it, right? You can smoke, you can drink, you can do coke and everything else.
Sure,
right?
sure.
Okay, so it's just opiate receptors.
Well, opiate receptors, and it's sort of indicated for opiate dependency and alcohol dependency. So we have, and there's been some other trials too. Naltrexone seems to have a general property of decreasing cravings or urges for a lot of different things.
Well, alcohol, it just takes the fun out of drinking a lot. That was my understanding. It doesn't stop anyone from drinking. They just find that they don't get much from drinking a six-pack or two six-packs.
And you look at it, numbers of people, hundreds of people in studies, and recognizing too that even though it works at the opioid receptors, that there's this communication all the time with the opioid receptors, your dopamine receptors, and all this crosstalk all the time. So there is, while it might not seem to be a direct effect, with that communication, it seems to have an impact then on the desire to, what happens at the opioid receptors to sort of to get euphoria and want to drink and want to use.
Just out of curiosity, opiate receptors, we have opiates natural in our body and everything.
Right, and endorphins.
So if you have this blocking it, does that mean that for that month you can't use heroin, but are you sadder? Are you less happy? Are you, I mean, you know what I mean? Like, does it affect your overall mood?
I mean, there's some risk of depression using these medications, but overall it doesn't seem to be that strong an effect, so you haven't sort of totally dampened that ability to have pleasure. But we know from people who have been using drugs for a long time that there really is sort of a difficulty experiencing joy in the early recovery period, right, for any sort of
Now, do they have good outcomes long term?
It's funny because one of the things with the tablets is it's not nearly as effective as the other things like Suboxone and methadone. But what they found is that it works better. You have to be in treatment. You have to have sort of community supports. So there really has to be, again, sort of a network or a foundation around you with this. And what they found then that those things improve the effectiveness of the naltrexone. And then also by using the injectable, by having that stays in your system, that also seems to further improve the odds of doing well with this medication. So a lot of people are interested in this in a corrections population where you have sort of more oversight. But also people are interested in this as a less toxic medication. Right. Naltrexone has less long-term effects. It's easier to sort of stop using than the other treatments like Suboxone and methadone. So one of the ideas here is that this sort of then gives us a fuller spectrum of medications, a less toxic alternative after behavioral interventions that should be part of the toolbox around dealing with opiate dependency and alcohol dependency.
Now, we talked about this before, and we're going to finish up with this. But just how expensive is it?
So this, again, I did a presentation on this about a month ago in Bennington. Cost-wise, if you just look at the medication, it's a new medication, it's on patent, it's about $1,300 for a month of this versus $300 to $600 for Suboxone for a month versus much less for methadone, much less for the pills. But maybe if you look at the overall system, you might find that when you talk about decreasing incarceration, increasing productivity, that it might be worthwhile.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments. I hope you find this show helpful to you, and we'll be back next week.
Yeah, take care.